Picture the Roman Forum in the year 67 AD. Marble columns gleam in the Mediterranean sun, senators in white togas mingle with merchants, and the ever-present buzz of rumor clings to the air like incense smoke. Suddenly, the crowd parts, not out of courtesy but out of instinct. For here comes the emperor himself, Nero, moving with theatrical confidence, his presence commanding every eye. Yet it isn't Nero alone who seizes their attention, it's the figure at his side. Draped in silks and shimmering jewels, a young woman glides beside him, her beauty so striking that heads turn, whispers ripple, and hearts stumble between awe and dread. The people know, Rome always knows, this woman is not who she appears to be. Her face carries a strange familiarity, echoing the memory of an empress long dead. Beneath the layers of silk and cosmetics, she was once a boy named Sporus. And what Nero did to transform him body and soul remains one of the darkest, most grotesque chapters in the theatre of imperial Rome. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like yet another act of imperial excess, a scandal to be gossiped about in taverns and recorded with disdain by historians. But what unfolded in this grotesque parade was far more than eccentricity. It was the story of absolute power twisting grief into delusion, of love collapsing into possession, and of one human life reduced to a living doll meant to soothe the emperor's madness. Sporus's story is not merely about cruelty, it is about identity stripped away, survival under unimaginable torment, and the silent resilience of a boy trapped in the fantasies of the most dangerous man in the world. Nero himself was no stranger to spectacle. He fancied himself an artist, a god, even the star of his own eternal performance. Yet as he walked the streets with Sporus dressed as his empress, Rome saw not majesty but a macabre shadow play. The ghost of Poppaea Sabina, Nero's beloved and ill-fated wife, reborn in the body of a boy. Citizens whispered behind their hands, terrified to be overheard, but unable to look away. In Roman culture, appearances were everything. Honor, power, legitimacy were displayed on the body as much as they were declared in words. Here, Nero flaunted not just his grief, but his dominion over life, death, and even gender itself. Imagine standing in that crowd. You would feel both fascination and revulsion. The perfume of imported spices carried on the summer air, the bright clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoing from nearby streets, and in the midst of it all, the emperor parading his conquest, an emperor whose whims could kill millions, now bending reality to preserve the memory of one lost woman. What you were seeing wasn't just decadence, it was power unhinged, unchecked, and terrifying. Because the truth was plain. The figure at Nero's side, now called Sabina in memory of the dead empress, had not chosen this path. Sporus had been chosen, molded, broken, and reshaped. What the world witnessed was not love but possession. The emperor had taken grief, carved it into human flesh, and forced an unwilling soul into a role from which there was no escape. Even now, nearly 2,000 years later, the story grips us because it feels both alien and eerily familiar. We recognize in it the dangers of unchecked power, the thin line between devotion and obsession, and the cruelty that emerges when one person begins to treat another not as a human being, but as an object of fantasy. The name Sporus may not appear often in history books, but once heard, it lingers because his life stands as a haunting reminder of what it means when power devours compassion, and when grief turns into something monstrous. But to understand how this parade came to be, how a Roman emperor came to walk beside a boy remade into his dead wife, we must go back to the beginning, to Nero himself, for he was not always the mad tyrant remembered by history. In the early years of his reign, Rome had seen in him not a monster, but a miracle, a boy emperor, young and promising, who seemed to herald the dawn of a golden age. And yet, as we will see, that promise unraveled into paranoia, cruelty, and ultimately into the nightmarish fate of Sporus. When Nero first ascended the throne at just 16 years old, Rome had reason to hope. Here was a youth born into the tangled lines of Julio-Claudian blood, groomed by tutors, celebrated by philosophers, and placed upon the imperial throne by the will of his mother Agrippina. The people believed they were witnessing the beginning of a new golden age. Taxes were reduced, public games and spectacles were funded generously, and for the first time in years, the emperor himself seemed to delight in mingling with the common people. Nero sang, acted, and even competed in games scandalous to the aristocracy but intoxicating to the masses. He wasn't a distant godlike ruler cloaked in marble dignity, but a young man who seemed approachable, almost human. The city, so often weary from war and political intrigue, welcomed the novelty. For a moment, it felt as if Rome might be reborn. But the empire's throne was a poisoned chalice, and Nero soon drank deeply from it. Behind the laughter of the theatres and the cheers of the circus lay a darker truth. Absolute power isolates. At first, Nero seemed eager to govern wisely, leaning on the counsel of Seneca and Burrus. Yet the pressures of rule soon grew unbearable. In an empire of 60 million souls, there was not a single voice allowed to contradict him. Senators flattered him, generals feared him, and even his closest companions learned that survival meant silence. With every year that passed, the circle around Nero tightened, until all that remained was his own reflection. The boy who had once promised Rome renewal was slowly hardening into a man consumed by suspicion. Paranoia is a poison that spreads quietly. Every glance becomes a threat. Every silence a potential betrayal. Nero lived with the knowledge that countless eyes coveted his throne, that whispers plotted in shadows, and that daggers might one day be raised against him. The Praetorian Guard, meant to protect him, also reminded him daily that emperors before him had been unseated by the very soldiers sworn to defend them. Isolation gnawed at his mind, and the hunger for love, the kind of love that could steady him, grew more desperate. Perhaps this is why, when he first encountered Poppaea Sabina, he fell not with reason but with obsession. Poppaea was unlike anyone Nero had ever known. Intelligent, ambitious, dazzling in beauty, she was as much strategist as seductress. Rome already knew her name, for she had moved skillfully through the highest ranks of society before Nero laid eyes upon her. Compared to Octavia, Nero's first wife, a dutiful, restrained woman, chosen for political alliance, Poppaea was fire. Where Octavia's quiet dignity left Nero unmoved, Poppaea commanded every room she entered. She did not wait for power to be handed to her. She reached for it with both hands, and in doing so, became irresistible. What began as an affair quickly consumed the emperor's life. Nero lavished her with gifts from the far corners of the empire, silks from the east, jewels mined from distant lands, perfumes that filled entire chambers with their fragrance. Yet gifts were not enough. Nero began to guard her jealously, stationing soldiers to watch her every movement, ensuring that no man could so much as meet her eyes without risking his wrath. To love Poppaea was, in Nero's mind, not merely to cherish her but to possess her completely. It was no longer romance, it was ownership disguised as devotion. Within the palace walls, portraits and statues of Poppaea multiplied, filling chambers until it seemed she was present in every corner. Nero, intoxicated by her presence, blurred the line between admiration and worship. Ancient historians wrote that he would sit for hours, gazing at her, as though the sight of her alone was enough to sustain him. To the courtiers who watched in silence, it was clear Poppaea was no longer a woman in Nero's eyes. She was a symbol, a talisman of beauty and power, and Nero had convinced himself that as long as he possessed her, he possessed the world. But possession is fragile, and even emperors cannot control the will of those they claim to love. Poppaea, shrewd and unafraid, was not content to be a silent ornament. She challenged him, argued with him, mocked his artistic ambitions when they fell short. Unlike the rest of the court, she refused to tiptoe around his vanity. Perhaps she knew the risks, perhaps she believed her influence over him would shield her. But in the heart of a man already haunted by suspicion, each act of defiance struck like a blade, and in time, that blade would cut not only her life short but also sever the last thread holding Nero's sanity together. The day that shattered everything began like so many others, with tension simmering just beneath the surface of the imperial palace. Poppaea was pregnant again, and her condition should have softened Nero's temper, for she carried not only his wife's beauty but the promise of a new heir. Yet instead of calm, Nero's moods grew more violent, as if the weight of fatherhood exposed his inadequacies. Some say the quarrel started because Nero returned late from the circus, obsessed with his chariot races. Others whisper it was his endless theatrical performances, which Poppaea dared to criticize, reminding him he was an emperor first, an actor second. Whatever the cause, the argument grew into something volcanic, as it so often did. Tacitus tells us that, in the fury of their exchange, Nero struck her. Others write that he kicked her, his rage directed at the very womb that carried their child. However it happened, the blow was fatal. Poppaea collapsed, her unborn child lost with her. In that instant, Nero crossed a threshold from which he could never return. He had murdered the very woman he claimed to adore more than life itself. The Empress who had commanded his devotion lay broken, not by conspirators or enemies, but by his own hand. The aftermath was chaos wrapped in silence. Ancient sources paint a grotesque scene. Nero, realizing what he had done, fell to his knees beside her body, alternately begging forgiveness and shouting commands as though his imperial voice might order her back to life. Physicians were summoned at once, bribed with fortunes, and threatened with torture, but no healing art of Rome could reverse what had been unleashed in that moment of rage. By nightfall, Poppaea was gone, and with her, Nero's last tether to reality. Roman tradition dictated that the body of the dead be burned swiftly, the smoke rising as an offering to the gods. But Nero refused. He would not let the flames devour her. Instead, he ordered her embalmed, entombed in grandeur surpassing even the mausoleums of past emperors. He declared her divine, worshipped her as a goddess, and forced his court to share in the delusion. At banquets, her place at the table remained empty but sacred, as though she might return at any moment. Courtiers addressed her in the present tense, careful never to speak of her in the past, for fear that truth might cost them their lives. In the corridors of the palace, it was as if Poppaea still lived, her ghost sustained by fear and the emperor's madness. Nero's grief became theatre. He spoke to her corpse, adorned her likeness with jewels, and demanded rituals that blurred the boundary between mourning and obsession. To the people of Rome, accustomed to spectacle but rooted in custom, this was both shocking and unsettling. An emperor was supposed to embody the stoic dignity of the state, yet here was Nero, collapsing in public, enslaved to his own grief. And yet, beneath the horror, there was something pitiful too. For all his armies and his authority, he could not command death to yield. The man who ruled the world was powerless before the silence of a tomb. But grief, when mixed with power, is dangerous. Instead of finding healing, Nero sought to recreate what he had destroyed. He would not accept the finality of Poppaea's death. In his mind, she could be conjured again, reborn, made real once more if only he bent reality far enough to his will. And it was in this crucible of loss and delusion that Sporus first entered his gaze, a boy of tender age whose face carried a resemblance so uncanny to the lost Empress that, for Nero, it was as though fate itself had delivered him a second chance. Sporus could not have known that the emperor's glance that day was not admiration but a sentence. In the shadow of Poppaea's tomb, Nero had found his substitute, his vessel for resurrection, and the boy's life was about to become a nightmare from which there would be no waking. Sporus was barely more than a boy, perhaps 14 or 15, and like many who grew up in the orbit of the imperial household, he had lived in a peculiar mixture of privilege and peril. He had been born a slave, later freed, and educated within the palace walls, trained for administrative service. For a young freedman, such a life carried opportunities, proximity to power, access to refinement, the possibility of advancement. But it also meant complete dependence. Everything Sporus was, every step he took, existed at the mercy of imperial favor. To rise in such an environment was possible, but to fall was fatal. What set him apart was not his wit, nor his skill with accounts, nor his talent for service. It was his face. Ancient sources agree that Sporus bore an extraordinary resemblance to the late Poppaea, particularly in the delicacy of his features and the shape of his eyes. To most, it might have been a passing likeness, a quirk of nature, but to Nero, consumed by grief and madness, it was revelation. For a man who had convinced himself he could command gods and bend the world to his desires, this resemblance was no coincidence, it was providence. He looked upon Sporus and saw Poppaea returned. But there was one problem, one undeniable fact. Sporus was male. To ordinary minds, this would have been an insurmountable boundary. But Nero was no ordinary mind. He was an emperor unshackled by morality, a man who had already spoken to corpses and enthroned ghosts. In his delusion, changing the essence of another human being was a trivial obstacle. If Sporus was to become Poppaea reborn, then Nero would make it so, no matter the cost. The command was given. Physicians were summoned, not for healing but for mutilation. Sporus was forced to undergo a brutal procedure, castration, an operation so dangerous in antiquity that it often ended in death from blood loss or infection. There was no anesthesia beyond crude herbal sedatives, no antiseptics to prevent fever. He would have been restrained, surrounded by guards, his cries of agony echoing off the marble walls while the Emperor's will was carried out upon his body. When it was done, the boy who had been Sporus was forever changed, not by choice, but by decree. His identity was shattered, replaced by a role he had never asked to play. And Nero was not finished. The transformation was not merely physical, it was total. Sporus was dressed in the gowns once worn by Poppaea, adorned with her jewels, perfumed with the same oils. Makeup was applied to soften his features, his hair styled in elaborate fashions that had once crowned the Empress. Tutors taught him how to move, how to sit, how to gesture like a woman. He was instructed to alter his voice, to walk with grace instead of strength, to embody the memory of the woman whose place he was to fill. Piece by piece, day after day, his former self was erased, and in its place a phantom was constructed. Sabina, the Empress, reborn. For Nero, this was triumph. He had undone the irreversible, or so he told himself. For Sporus, it was a prison, with no walls, a role in a performance from which there was no escape. Each morning, he awoke to mirrors that reflected not the boy he had been, but the Empress he had been forced to become. Each jewel he wore was a chain, each lesson in femininity, a further burial of his true self. And around him, the entire court played along, pretending not to see the horror, because to speak the truth was to court death. Rome had long been a place of spectacle, where theatre and reality often blurred, but never before had the empire witnessed something so grotesque. To take a living soul and mold him into the shadow of the dead, this was a cruelty that shocked even the decadent aristocrats, who had seen emperors commit atrocities beyond measure. Yet none dared intervene. To oppose Nero was to vanish, and so Sporus, still a teenager, found himself at the center of an imperial tragedy, a living doll in the hands of a man who believed himself greater than the gods. The transformation reached its most grotesque display in the spring of 67 AD. Nero, never content with illusion alone, decided that the charade must be made complete. He would marry Sporus. Preparations unfolded with the same extravagance that had once accompanied his union with Poppaea. The palace was filled with seamstresses laboring over gowns designed to disguise what remained of Sporus's masculinity, jewelers resetting gems that had once adorned Poppaea into fresh diadems, and perfumers crafting oils to scent the boy as though he were truly the Empress reborn. To outsiders unaware of the truth, it might have seemed like the celebration of a legitimate imperial marriage, but to those who knew, it was a chilling theatre, staged by a man who could not distinguish between devotion and delusion. The ceremony itself was a spectacle Rome would never forget. Thousands of lamps illuminated the vast hall of the palace, casting a golden glow over imported flowers, marble statues, and tapestries woven with mythic scenes. Musicians played hymns of union, while senators, generals, and courtiers, their faces carefully schooled into masks of joy, offered congratulations and costly gifts. Before the gods and the empire, Nero placed his hand upon Sporus's and declared him Sabina, his Empress. Bread was broken, vows exchanged, and documents signed. Every ritual of Roman matrimony was observed, as though the fiction could be made real by sheer will. For Nero, it was no act of satire but of sincerity. He spoke to Sporus as he had spoken to Poppaea, recalling memories that had never belonged to the boy, reliving conversations that had never taken place. When he looked upon him, he did not see a youth torn from himself, but a miracle of resurrection. For Sporus, every moment was performance, each word a calculation for survival. To falter, to break character, was to risk death. Ancient accounts tell us that he grew skilled at playing this role, anticipating Nero's moods, echoing the Empress's supposed responses. Outwardly, he became the image Nero demanded. Inwardly, he withdrew further and further into himself, the boy Sporus vanishing behind the painted mask of Sabina. The life that followed was gilded, but gilded like a cage. Sporus was granted a household staff, luxurious quarters, even his own litter to be carried through the streets like a true empress. He dined at Nero's side, appeared with him in public, travelled in ceremonial processions. To the eyes of the world, he occupied the throne of Roman womanhood, the highest place in the empire short of divinity. But luxury could not soften the torment of having one's very identity erased. Each mirror reflected not the self, but the ghost of another. Each jewel he wore was a relic of Poppaea, each gown a reminder that he existed now, only as a replacement, a vessel for a memory he could never truly embody. The courtiers, too, were trapped in the theatre. They bowed to Sporus as Empress, addressed him by the dead woman's name, and laughed dutifully at Nero's jokes as though nothing were grotesque about the situation. In Rome, to play along was survival. Yet behind closed doors, one can imagine the whispered horror, the way aristocrats must have exchanged wary glances, knowing they were participating in something profoundly unnatural. It was not merely scandalous, it was frightening. For if the emperor could remake reality to this extent, what other boundaries might he shatter? And yet, as twisted as the marriage was, it also revealed something pitiful about Nero. For beneath the cruelty and delusion lay a man unable to accept loss. He had conquered armies, commanded legions, ruled the greatest empire on earth, and still, he could not master death. He had destroyed the woman he loved, and in his desperation, he sought to create her anew, no matter how many lives he broke in the process. For Sporus, this was a nightmare without end. For Nero, it was the only way he knew to keep the illusion of love alive. For more than 2 years, Sporus lived in this grotesque theatre, carrying the weight of an identity that was not his own. Each morning began with servants dressing him in silks and arranging his hair in elaborate coils that mimicked the late Empress's style. Cosmetics were applied carefully to soften his features, to erase the last hints of the boy he had once been. Tutors corrected his posture, trained his gestures, reminded him to tilt his chin just so, to fold his hands with grace rather than strength. His voice was rehearsed endlessly, coaxed into tones that sounded more feminine, though beneath the artifice there was always the tremor of someone forced to speak against his own nature. Day after day, the performance consumed him until it became second nature. To falter was unthinkable, for faltering meant death. In public, Nero flaunted him as though nothing about the arrangement was strange. Together, they appeared at banquets, in the theatre, even in religious ceremonies, the emperor proudly displaying his new empress to Rome and beyond. When Nero embarked on his grand tour of Greece, Sporus was paraded beside him, carried through cities where poets and philosophers were commanded to honor the couple as though they were gods. Imagine the bewilderment of foreign dignitaries, watching the conqueror of nations walk hand in hand with a boy dressed as a woman, demanding recognition of a lie. To question the spectacle was to risk Roman wrath. So they smiled, applauded, and offered gifts, while beneath the surface, fascination and unease swirled like a storm. But for Sporus, this life of luxury was only another form of torment. The wealth, the jewels, the servants, all of it was a mask covering the slow erasure of his soul. Each night he lay in chambers decorated with images of Poppaea, the woman he was forced to embody but could never truly be. Every word from Nero reinforced the fiction. The emperor reminisced about moments that had never happened, laughed about memories that had never been shared, and demanded that Sporus answer as though he were truly her. The boy's own past, his childhood, his name, all of it was buried beneath the crushing weight of another's identity. He was not Sporus. He was Sabina. And yet, deep within, some fragment of the boy endured, silent and suffering, waiting for a chance to reclaim himself. The court, too, played its part. Senators addressed Sporus with the honorifics of an empress, bowing low, offering gifts, forcing smiles. At banquets, they raised their cups to his health, all the while choking down their horror. Every gesture was calculated to please the emperor, to affirm the reality he demanded they believe. No one dared break the illusion, for in Nero's Rome, truth was dangerous and silence was survival. The empire itself had become a stage, and everyone upon it an actor, their lines dictated by the whims of one man. Yet cracks were forming in the grand facade. Nero's extravagance drained the treasury, his indulgence in art and spectacle alienated generals and senators alike, and his paranoia deepened with every passing year. Rebellions stirred in distant provinces, and the Praetorian Guard, once his shield, began to waver in loyalty. Rome, long accustomed to excess, was growing weary of the emperor's madness, and as discontent swelled, Sporus's place at Nero's side became ever more precarious. For if the emperor fell, what would become of the boy who embodied his delusion? The answer would come swiftly and brutally, for empires do not forgive madness forever. By 68 AD, the tide had turned, and Nero's world, along with Sporus's fragile survival, would collapse in fire and blood. And so the curtain fell on Sporus, a life that had never been allowed to belong to itself. He was remembered in fragments, lines scattered through the works of Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius. Dio always filtered through the lenses of men who saw him not as a person, but as a symptom of Rome's decline. To them, Sporus was proof of Nero's madness, of the empire's moral corruption, of decadence carried to its extreme. Yet in these accounts, the boy himself is almost absent, his voice drowned beneath the noise of judgment. What were his thoughts as he was dressed in Poppaea's silks? What dreams did he bury beneath the layers of makeup and jewels? History offers no answers. It preserves the spectacle, but not the soul. That silence is perhaps the most haunting part of his story. For while emperors rise and fall in the chronicles of Rome, their victories carved into stone, Sporus appears only as a shadow, an echo, a footnote. And yet, his suffering was as real as any legionary's sacrifice, his resilience as remarkable as any general's triumph. He was a boy denied the right to grow into himself, reshaped into a phantom, and forced to act in a play whose script was written by madness. In his final act, choosing death over humiliation, he seized, at last, something that was truly his own. Looking back, we might be tempted to see Sporus as merely a victim, but there is another way to read his story, as a testament to endurance. For years, he survived inside Nero's fantasy, performing flawlessly under constant threat, navigating dangers that would have crushed many others. He endured the gaze of an emperor, the whispers of the court, the stares of the public, and the endless erasure of his identity. And though it ended in tragedy, his final choice was not submission but refusal. He may have been robbed of everything else, but in that last moment, he reclaimed his agency. The tragedy of Sporus forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power and humanity. It shows us what happens when grief and obsession are left unchecked, when rulers treat people as objects to satisfy desire, and when society, out of fear or complacency, plays along with cruelty. But it also shows us the resilience of the human spirit, that even in the most unbearable of circumstances, the will to resist, however small, can never be completely extinguished. 2,000 years later, as we walk through the ruins of Rome, beneath arches and columns that once bore witness to this story, it is easy to be dazzled by the grandeur of empire. But behind every monument lies another kind of history, not of emperors and battles, but of those who suffered in silence, whose names are almost forgotten. Sporus is one of them. His story is not carved into triumphal arches or celebrated in marble statues, yet it lingers, fragile but unyielding, in the pages of history. Perhaps that is why his name still unsettles us. Because in Sporus we see not only the cruelty of a long-dead empire, but the enduring truth that power, unchecked, will always seek to reshape others in its own image. And we are reminded, too, of the quiet defiance of a boy who refused, in the end, to be defined entirely by another's will.